Hello everyone, it's Tom. This model has taken me 7 months to complete and I cannot wait to show you how I went about it. The first part ended with the interior of the hull being constructed, and before I began on the outside I also completed the interior of the turret. However, if you do not wish to plan to use clear plastic provided to show your hard work, then there's no reason to do it, as none of it can be seen once the roof is on. I began with the drive wheel, and unbeknownst to me at this time, this was the worst decision I could have done, but there'll be more of that later on. For now, if you do plan to build this kit, or any Tiger, avoid gluing the drive wheel in position. All parts were glued in place using Tamiya extra thin cement, they went together perfectly, and as with all Tiger models, there's a lot of wheels. With all the wheels good to go, I could then give them a dry fit, as it can get a little confusing with so many different types of wheels. The thing that surprised me with this model was the amount of detail that comes with it and all the small parts that need cleaning up before gluing. It did take longer than I was expecting, but it was worth it in the end. And the kit also comes with some photo etch that I carefully removed and glued with some CA glue. One thing that I did find challenging with this kit though was securing the top cover of the hull. It did require some holding in place, it fitted well, it just needed encouragement to stay while the glue and plastic dried. And once that was on, it was then back to all the intricate parts, and one last piece of detail was to give the wheel some small battle damage from years of service over rough terrain. Overall though, I was really pleased with how it went together and all the detail that the kit has, and with the build complete, I could then move on to the painting. Those familiar with Adam Wilder will be aware that he has recently released a book through AK Interactive showing how layering allows modelers to obtain a more striking and realistic look, and that is a principle that I wanted to follow with this kit. I wanted to achieve a realistic winter camouflage scheme based on this Tiger tank commanded by Michael Wittmann on the Eastern Front in early 1944. The idea is that the worn white painted areas reveals parts of the original camouflage, which consisted of stripes of choco brown and olive grun over a Dunkelgelb base colour. The original camouflage colours are hotly debated since black and white photos do not give too many clues away. However, the scheme I'm going with is the most accepted hypothesis. As you can see, I start by priming the model with Mr. Surfacer 1000 black, which was then followed by a reddish brown mixture of around 90% XF64 and 10% XF7. This layer will simulate the factory base layer and provide a base for chipping in the subsequent layers. After giving the red-brown layer time to cure, I then miscoated some ammo scratches effect. There is another fluid by ammo called heavy chipping, but scratches works just as well in my opinion. I found the best way is to miscoat a few layers, let it dry, then paint your model, and before that paint, in this case the Dunkelgelb, choco brown and olive grun can fully cure, get to work on scratching and chipping. The water will help regardless, but this is the best method that works for me. I didn't show the spraying of the pattern as my camera wouldn't focus, but for fine work I use a 0.2 needle with a low pressure to help me. With the scratches effect, when you apply water to the paint layer, that water reacts with the chipping layer underneath, which allows you to scratch it away. If you've never used it before, I definitely recommend that you practice on a plastic spoon or a piece of sprue, or the underside of the model where it won't be seen. That being said, I did want to add some extra chips where the paint was being stubborn, so for this I used Ammo's chipping paint. At this point I wasn't too happy with how it was looking, so I gave the tank a miscoat of Dunkelgelb just to tone down the stripes. This was then followed up with a wash of Ammo's brown wash for German dark yellow. I didn't apply any clear coat at this stage, and to tidy up the inevitable mess I used some odourless thinner. My attention could then turn to the detail painting, and I began with some oil paints to emphasise the chips with some rust. For this I used Winsor & Newton's burnt umber, and it was here that I was beginning to see the fruits of my labour. I did go over the top with the pre-winter paint, and the chipping and rust is a good example, but I knew that it would be toned down by the subsequent layers. Things like the tow cables were first painted in a neutral grey, then dry brushed with some Mr Metal silver and rust wash. German grey was used for the tools, as well as Iraqi sand and raw umber for the wooden handles. I found when gluing tools in place, it's always helpful to make sure that you can slide a piece of paper underneath to keep your work looking good. I don't think I recorded it, but before the rust wash was applied to the tools, I gave them a dry brush with some Mr Metal silver to simulate where they'd been heavily used. Finally content with how it was looking, I then applied the decals. This kit comes with some kill rings for the turret, and although they can be seen in some photos, it's believed that they're there for propaganda, and Wittmann and his team would have removed them shortly after their photo shoot, where he was being awarded a Knight's Cross was complete. The decal process I follow is usually followed after a clear coat to help the decals position better on the surface. However, this time, with only 4 decals to place, I decided against a clear coat. I did however seal them in with some X22 clear afterwards. This was followed up with some ammo scratches again before I could then begin applying the winter camouflage. The white colour was applied irregularly, covering more on some areas than others. For example, I didn't paint any white where the spare links would have been to simulate that they'd been used. I dialed down the air pressure and placed the .2 needle back into my airbrush for this to give me better control of the paint. When I was happy, I then got out the water and a stiff brush and began to remove the paint. The idea of this layer is to simulate an old white paint, whereas the white oil paint layer later on will simulate some fresh paint. The weathering began by applying a filter called Tan for free tone camouflage on the areas with less white paint. This certainly turned the contrast up a notch, which I liked. I also subscribed to the idea of going over some of the weld beads with a deep grey panel line wash. This was to bring back out the contrast of all the fine detail. I then used Ammo's oil brusher dust and streaking brushed cold dirt grey to create dirt streaks with the oil dot technique. First the dots were applied, then blended with a flat brush moistened with enamel odorless thinner. If sometimes it doesn't quite go right, you can always re-go over it, which I found I had to do a few times. This was done in vertical passes to simulate where the rain had washed down. The wheels had also been receiving the same treatment and were also given a wash of fresh engine oil, and this was all sealed in with XF86. Now I mentioned at the beginning not to glue in the drive wheel. What this meant was that I had to paint the tracks in 2 parts. It was frustrating initially, but not the end of the world. I gave them a prime in Mr. Surfacer to create some artificial shadows, then a couple of light coats of Vallejo rust. I then followed this up with Vallejo light rust, but only a very thin dusting. Once the paint had dried, I was then able to dry brush Mr. Metal Silver to simulate where the tracks had worn down, and this was done on the outside and the inside. Then finally I made my own mud consisting of AK wet ground, seagrass, and to thicken it up, some winter soil pigments. This was pushed into the tracks to simulate mud compressing between the links. Using the oil dot technique again, a white oil paint was used to simulate a fresher looking winter camouflage. As you can see here, I'm using a piece of cardboard as a palette to soak up the linseed oil in the paint. This would usually be soaked up by a canvas, but as we're painting on plastic and the cardboard does a good job, just make sure to leave it for a couple of hours. Again, the oil was blended using a flat brush moistened with odorless thinner. Like I mentioned before, if you're not happy, you can apply and remove it to your heart's content, as it won't impact the acrylics below. The same technique was applied on the turret in a downward motion to create streaking marks. AK's wet ground effect was used to build on the first layer of the thicker mud concoction that I'd made earlier, and placed it in areas taken from a reference image. But as you can imagine, mud gets everywhere, so don't feel like you need to be too exact. I concentrated along the bottom of the hull and into areas where the mud would have flicked up and stuck. To give further depth to the look and to blend it into the model, I used Ammo's wet ground splash effects to flick some splatters all around the tank. The next phase of this build will be a small winter base, so this will be further enhanced to help it blend into the vignette. I did go a little too far though, so I managed to remove a few splashes with some odorless thinner, being careful not to do too much damage to the underlying layers. It was then time to do a few last minute touch-ups, and this consisted of some winter soil being stippled into areas where mud would build up, underneath the turret perhaps, and where the crew were climbing up and down and around the hatches. The exhaust covers were also touched up as they were looking rather clean. For this I used Vallejo's rust and light rust, and I would say it was a technique between normal painting and dry brushing, just enough paint to do the job. And finally, one last thing to do was add more engine grind and engine oil to the top deck, and this really brought the tank alive. You can see some close-up images of my Instagram account where I document all my builds, and the link is down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you like my content. This kit has been an absolute joy to build, and along with the Ferrari, my best kits yet. For £50 this kit is a steal for what you get, and I highly recommend it. I'll leave you with the finished kit and an AI photo of the tank on the eastern front. I think it blends in quite well. Tell me what you think below, and thanks for watching.